Hi everyone, I'm Dr. Brad Musil, and this is a reading of The Utility of Religion, Mill, Nietzsche, and James. This will be Section A of Part 3 from Chapter 3, William James and the Varieties of Religious Experience. Again, this is Section A, James's Case for the Utility of Religion. In addition to offering an extensive description of religious phenomena, James is expressly concerned with gauging the usefulness of religion. The 14th and 15th lectures in Varieties, for example, are specifically devoted to an analysis of the value of saintliness, which for James signifies the fruits of religion. Accordingly, he prefaces these lectures by saying, quote, "We have now passed in review the more important of the phenomena which are regarded as fruits of genuine religion and characteristics of men who are devout. Today, we have to change our attitude from that of description to that of appreciation. We have to ask whether the fruits in question can help us to judge the absolute value of what religion adds to human life." End quote. Footnote 593 cites the source. As we see here, James is clearly interested in ascertaining the utility of religion. To his credit, he is also cautious when proposing to assess the fruits of religion, and he meticulously outlines his own methodology before proceeding. In doing so, he develops his empirical method, which he carefully distinguishes from theological approaches to religion, saying, quote, "What I then propose to do is, briefly stated, to test saintliness by common sense, to use human standards to help us decide how far the religious life commends itself as an ideal kind of human activity. If it commends itself, then any theological beliefs that may inspire it, in so far forth, will stand accredited. If not, then they will be discredited, and all without reference to anything but human working principles. It is but the elimination of the humanly unfit and the survival of the humanly fittest, applied to religious beliefs." End quote. Footnote 594 cites the source. James also makes it a point to stress that we are all unique characters, and that those who are religious require and benefit from different elements of religion. Indeed, he suggests we must raise the question, quote, "Are different functions in the organism of humanity allotted to different types of man, so that some may really be the better for a religion of consolation and reassurance, whilst others are better for one of terror and reproof?" End quote. Footnote 595 cites the source. In turn, he argues that it is becoming clearer with time that this is, in fact, befitting of religious experience. Interestingly, one consequence of this is that it is difficult, if not impossible, to try to judge the fruits of religion in any kind of objective and impartial manner. As James says, quote, "If it be so, how can any possible judge or critic help being biased in favor of the religion by which his own needs are best met? He aspires to impartiality, but he is too close to the struggle." End quote. Footnote 596 cites the source. To be sure, this is something anyone interested in studying the usefulness of religion ought to be cognizant of, and James should be commended for highlighting the difficulty associated with assessing the prospects of religion's utility. I want to stress that, as was the case with his descriptive account of religious phenomena, James is chiefly interested in the utility of individual religion. Having said this, James does make some suggestions regarding the utility of institutional religion that I think deserve mention before proceeding to his more extensive analysis of individual religion. Most notably, he points out that, unlike instances of individual religion, corporate ambitions become prominent and problematic in cases of institutional religion. James notes that, in their institutional form, religions, quote, "become ecclesiastical institutions with corporate ambitions of their own. The spirit of politics and the lust of dogmatic rule are then apt to enter and to contaminate the originally innocent thing." End quote. Footnote 597 cites the source. Hence, according to James, as religion is institutionalized, it becomes less genuine and more corrupted by societal and corporate influences. By contrast, individual religion is not thought to be tainted by such external influences. For this reason, James thinks it also provides a better indication of the legitimate fruits of religion, given that it entails a pure and unadulterated form of belief. Subsequently, James suggests that many of the harms typically associated with religion do not properly belong to it, but instead result from the corrupting influences associated with institutional religion. Accordingly, he observes that, quote, "The baseness so commonly charged to religion's account are thus, almost all of them, not chargeable at all to religion proper, but rather to religion's wicked practical partner, the spirit of corporate dominion." End quote. Footnote 598 cites the source, and that, quote, "For many of the historic aberrations which have been laid to her charge, religion as such, then, is not to blame." End quote. Footnote 599 cites the source. In sum, James implores us not to lose sight of this critical distinction between individual and institutional religion when assessing the utility of religion, saying, quote, I beseech you never to confound the phenomena of mere tribal or corporate psychology, which it, i.e. institutional religion, presents, with those manifestations of the purely interior life, which are the exclusive object of our study, end quote. Footnote 600 cites the source. I believe James's reflections on the effects of institutional religion are mostly accurate, and I'm willing to grant that the more deleterious qualities of religion likely stem from its institutionalization. However, while James is concerned exclusively with individual religion, which is no doubt a significant qualification, this dissertation is not limited in such a manner. Therefore, the consequences, both good and bad, associated with institutional religion must be incorporated into the present analysis of religion's utility. Recall my discussion of a similar point in Chapter 1, where I mentioned that Mill emphasizes that the negative consequences associated with some forms of religion, for example violence, quote, do not belong to religion in itself, but to particular forms of it, and afford no argument against the usefulness of any religions except those by which such enormities are encouraged. Uh, End quote. Footnote 601 cites the source. As I suggested there, the fact that some forms of religion may be devoid of the negative effects associated with other forms does not give us license to ignore the negative effects associated with those other forms, just as it would not be appropriate to exclude the benefits of some forms of a religion simply because other forms fail to produce them. What's more, as I suggested in Section A of Part 2, institutional religion likely plays a significant role in most religious experience. As I have argued, it's hard to imagine an individual having a religious experience devoid of its influence, in which case there's reason to worry that the perceived harms associated with the perceived harms James associates with institutional religion are prevalent as well. Some philosophers like Sam Harris suggest that these harms are significant too. Harris argues, for example, that extreme divisiveness and violence are inherent in any faithful observance of the world's most popular creeds, such as Islam and Christianity. Footnote 602. This is arguably the main thesis of Harris's controversial The End of Faith. End of footnote 602. All of this goes to show why I emphasize that the present analysis incorporates all varieties of religious experience, without any kind of qualification or exclusion. In the process of evaluating the utility of religion, James develops his notion of saintliness. Quote, the collective name of the ripe fruits of religion in a character, James suggests, is saintliness, end quote. Footnote 603 cites the source. According to James, saintliness exhibits four key features, which in turn are said to yield four natural consequences. Those four key features are 1. A sense of a higher ideal purpose or power, 2. A willing submission to this higher purpose or power, given its benevolent nature, 3. A newfound kind of joy and freedom that results from divorcing oneself from private and individual concerns, and 4. A more loving and harmonious demeanor towards others. Footnote 604 cites the source. More specifically, James describes the sensation of a higher ideal purpose or power as, quote, a feeling of being in a wider life than that of this world's selfish little interests, and the conviction, not merely intellectual, but as it were sensible, of the existence of an ideal power, end quote. Footnote 605 cites the source. Again, James makes it clear that this process need not involve a supernatural God, saying that, quote, in Christian saintliness, this power is always personified as God, but abstract moral ideals, civic or patriotic utopias, or inner visions of holiness or right may also be felt as the true lords and enlargers of our life, in ways which I described in the lecture on the reality of the unseen. End quote. Footnote 606 cites the source. Interestingly, James even seems to speak to Mill's Religion of Humanity, which I discussed in Chapter 1. Footnote 607. Accordingly, James mentions, quote, the enthusiasm of humanity, end quote, in a footnote in Varieties, and I cite the source there. End of footnote 607. Additionally, four natural consequences are said to arise from the four features of saintliness, and these are 1. Asceticism, 2. Strength of soul, 3. Purity, and 4. Charity. In the religious, according to James, we see minimization of worldly pleasures, i.e. asceticism, as communion with the higher ideal reality exposes the insignificance of such pleasures. The souls of the religious are also said to be strengthened as a result, which James describes as follows, quote, the sense of enlargement of life may be so uplifting that personal motives and inhibitions, commonly omnipotent, become too insignificant for notice, and new reaches of patience and fortitude open out. Fears and anxieties go, and blissful equanimity takes their place. Come heaven, come hell, it makes no difference now. End quote. Footnote 608 cites the source. At the same time, religious experience yields a newfound sense of internal purity and resolution of psychological discord that stems from the process of conversion, which I outlined in section B of part 2. Finally, the religious are said to be amicable and good-natured. In James's view, there is no doubt that these consequences can be beneficial, and he asserts that, quote, the best fruits of religious experience are the best things that history has to show, end quote. Footnote 609 cites the source. Indeed, according to James, quote, the highest flights of charity, devotion, trust, patience, bravery, to which the wings of human nature have spread themselves, have been flown for religious ideals, end quote. Footnote 610 cites the source. However, he thinks that the consequences of saintliness can prove to be problematic when found in excess. I will say more about this problem of excess in a moment, but first I want to say more about the specific ways in which James thinks these consequences of saintliness can be beneficial. On James's account, it would seem that the most obvious benefit of religion is the significant existential or psychological relief it provides to the individual. To put the point in the simplest terms possible, religion makes us happy. In describing the general process of unification within the will of an individual, which again James calls conversion in religious instances, whereby a kind of psychological harmony is attained, James says, quote, however it come, it brings a characteristic sort of relief, and never such extreme relief as when it is cast into the religious mold. Happiness, happiness, end quote. Footnote 611 cites the source. According to James, the sense of God, i.e. of a higher unseen power, coupled with God's benevolent nature, affords the religious individual a sense of ease otherwise unattainable. Quote, easily, permanently, and successfully, James claims, it often transforms the most intolerable misery into the profoundest and most enduring happiness, end quote. Footnote 612 cites the source. James grants that the existential ease associated with religion takes various forms, suggesting that, quote, the temper of the tranquil mindedness differs, of course, according to the person, according as the person is of a constitutionally somber or of a constitutionally cheerful cast of mind. In the somber, it partakes more of resignation and submission. In the cheerful, it is a joyous consent. End quote. Footnote 613 cites the source. In either case, religion is thought to provide, quote, a new zest which adds itself like a gift to life, end quote. Footnote 614 cites the source. And, quote, the transition from tenseness, self-responsibility, and worry to equanimity, receptivity, excuse me, and peace is the most wonderful of all those shiftings of inner equilibrium, end quote. Footnote 615 cites the source. It is important to note that the happiness James attaches to religion is not merely momentary relief from whatever ails us in our daily lives. Rather, religion is said to engender a more enthusiastic and lasting endorsement of life. On this point, James observes, quote, the more commonplace happinesses which we get are reliefs, occasioned by our momentary escapes from evils either experienced or threatened. But in its most characteristic embodiments, religious happiness is no more feeling of escape, end quote. Footnote 616 cites the source. Not only does James suggest that religion makes people happy and thereby improves their psychological well-being, he alleges that the kind of existential or psychological relief it provides is one of a kind. After pointing out that, quote, the essence of religious experiences, the thing by which we finally must judge them, must be that element or quality in them which we can meet nowhere else, end quote, footnote 617 cites the source, he ultimately argues that the kind of positive impulse he associates with religion comprises this quality. He elaborates on the unique nature of religious happiness in the following illuminating passage, quote, there is a state of mind known to religious men, but to no others, in which the will to assert ourselves and hold our own has been displaced by a willingness to close our mouths and be as nothing in the floods and waterspouts of God. Fear is not held in abeyance as it is by mere morality. It is positively expunged and washed away. It adds to life an enchantment which is not rationally or logically deducible from anything else. End quote. Footnote 618 cites the source. James insists that this difference in attitude toward life is significant, claiming that, quote, it makes a tremendous emotional and practical difference to one whether one accepts the universe in the drab, discolored way of stoic resignation to necessity, or with the passionate happiness of Christian saints, end quote. Footnote 619 cites the source. In this vein, James extensively discusses the relationship between morality and religion in an effort to elucidate what it is he thinks is uniquely beneficial about religion, suggesting at the outset that religion, quote, will prove to contain some elements which morality, pure and simple, does not contain, end quote. Footnote 620 cites the source. While, quote, at bottom, the whole concern of both morality and religion is with the manner of our acceptance of the universe, end quote. Footnote 621 cites the source. What stands out about religion, he argues, is that it entails a significantly more optimistic and cheerful attitude toward life than morality. Quote, for religion, he says, in its strong and fully developed manifestations, the service of the highest never is felt as a yoke, end quote. Footnote 622 cites the source. As a result, he concludes, quote, if religion is to mean anything definite for us, it seems to me that we ought to take it as meaning this added dimension of emotion, this enthusiastic temper of espousal, and religions where morality strictly so called can at best but bow its head in acquiescence. This sort of happiness in the absolute and everlasting is what we find nowhere but in religion, end quote. Footnote 623 cites the source. In making his case, James compares Marcus Aurelius, whom he associates with the moral character, with a medieval German Christian writer, and after quoting excerpts from each, he observes, quote, how much more active and positive the impulse of the Christian writer to accept his place in the universe is. Marcus Aurelius agrees to the scheme. The German theologian agrees with it, end quote. Footnote 624 cites the source. In a later lecture, James articulates another important difference between morality and religion. He suggests that morality demands a kind of active mental strenuousness from its adherents, whereas religion is said to yield a kind of passive mental relaxation. Along these lines, the teachings associated with many religions, such as the mind cure movement, is thought to be at odds with moral teachings. On this point, he writes, quote, official moralists advise us never to relax our strenuousness, but the persons I speak of find that all this conscious effort leads to nothing but failure and vexation in their hand. The way to success is by an anti-moralistic method, by the surrender of which I spoke in my second lecture. Passivity, not activity, relaxation, not intentness, should be now the rule, end quote. Footnote 625 cites the source. In other words, moralists tell us to always be thinking about what we ought to do, but for the religious, all is in God's hands. As I indicated in my earlier discussion of conversion, religion entails surrender to the higher power. This, in turn, yields an appreciable sense of freedom and joy on James's account, since the religious no longer feel bogged down by worries regarding the difficulties of their everyday lives. Both morality and religion are thought to be concerned with happiness, but, quote, even more in the religious life than the moral life, happiness and unhappiness seem to be the poles round which the interest revolves, end quote. Footnote 626 cites the source. Hence, in distinguishing religion from morality, James suggests that what is unique about religion is its decidedly optimistic outlook on life and the more pronounced sense of happiness it produces. Furthermore, he is quick to point out that religion's unique ability to engender a higher kind of happiness should weigh significantly in its favor when considering its utility, as indicated by the following passage. Quote, we are in the end absolutely dependent on the universe. In those states of mind which fall short of religion, the surrender is submitted to as an imposition of necessity, and the sacrifice is undergone at the very best without complaint. In the religious life, on the contrary, surrender and sacrifice are positively espoused. Even unnecessary givings up are added in order that the happiness may increase. Religion thus makes easy and felicitous what in any case is necessary, and if it be the only agency that can accomplish this result, its vital importance as a human faculty stands vindicated beyond dispute. It becomes an essential organ of our life, performing a function which no other portion of our nature can so successfully fulfill. End quote. Footnote 627 cites the source. Another benefit of religion is the charitable nature it engenders. James raises concerns about the tendencies of the religious to be overly charitable. More on this in a moment. But he clearly lauds the tenderness and charity he associates with them and expresses his misgivings about the opposite mentality of hardness and suspicion found in some non-religious characters, e.g. Schopenhauer and Nietzsche. According to James, in the case of the saint, quote, the ordinary motives to antipathy, which usually set such close bounds to tenderness among human beings, are inhibited. The saint loves his enemies and treats loathsome beggars as his brothers, end quote. Footnote 628 cites the source. James thinks that this is especially noteworthy insofar as it seems to run counter to our natural instincts. Footnote 629. As we saw in Chapter 2, being at odds with our natural instincts is why Nietzsche thinks the slave mentality underlying religions is so problematic. End of footnote 629. And so I'm going to go ahead and reread that sentence. James thinks that this is especially noteworthy insofar as it seems to run counter to our natural instincts, footnote 629. And for this reason, he thinks it constitutes a kind of paradox. Moreover, he speaks to the ability of the religious individual's charitable nature to enact positive change in others. Quote, treating those whom they met in spite of the past, in spite of all appearances, as worthy, they have stimulated them to be worthy, miraculously transformed them by their radiant example and by the challenge of their expectation. End quote. Footnote 630 cites the source. What's more, he purports, quote, we never can be sure in advance of any man that his salvation by the way of love is hopeless. End quote. Footnote 631 cites the source. James thinks that the charitable backbone of religion underlies other important aspects of society as well, suggesting that, quote, this belief in the essential sacredness of everyone expresses itself today in all sorts of humane customs and reformatory institutions, and in a growing aversion to the death penalty and to brutality and punishment, end quote. Footnote 632 cites the source. Ultimately, the charitable and loving nature of religion is said to be, at its core, regenerative. Quote, force destroys enemies, and the best that can be said of prudence is that it keeps what we already have in safety. But non-resistance, when successful, turns enemies into friends, and charity regenerates its objects. End quote. Footnote 633 cites the source. Perhaps most interestingly, James discusses a benefit of religion stemming from its inherent asceticism. Asceticism, on James's account, entails a kind of disentanglement from the shallow interest of everyday worldly affairs. As he says, quote, the man who lives in his religious center of personal energy and is actuated by spiritual enthusiasms differs from his previous carnal self in perfectly definite ways. End quote. Footnote 634 cites the source. Hence, the suggestion is the saints reveal that there is more to life than is typically suggested in our everyday lives. And James claims, quote, this practical proof that worldly wisdom may be safely transcended is the saint's magic gift to mankind. End quote. Footnote 635 cites the source. One outgrowth of asceticism is an embracing of poverty, which James maintains is, quote, felt at all times and under all creeds as one adornment of a saintly life, end quote. Footnote 636 cites the source. He marvels at this element of religion, since, once again, it runs so contrary to our natural inclinations. Footnote 637. More specifically, James calls this affinity for poverty a paradox, and a, quote, seemingly unnatural opinion, end quote. And I cite the source there. So that's the end of footnote 637. He argues that this divorce from worldly affairs and material pursuits can be seen as a virtue of religion because, if for no other reason, quote, lives based on having are less free than lives based on either on doing or on being, and in the interest of action, people subject to spiritual excitement throw away possessions as so many clogs, end quote. Footnote 638 cites the source. James emphasizes that money-minded individuals face a litany of worries that don't apply to individuals who can free themselves from the clutches of materialism. On this point, he observes, quote, there are thousands of conjunctures in which a wealth-bound man must be a slave, whilst a man for whom poverty has no terrors becomes a free man, end quote. Footnote 639 cites the source. Indeed, James is Socrates-like in his disdain for the materialism that tends to run rampant in any typical human society. Footnote 640. In Plato's Republic, Socrates suggests that when an individual pursues material wealth, he or she is feeding an unnecessary desire, as opposed to a necessary desire, such as wanting food, sleep, etc., which is implicitly harmful to the individual. In pursuing such unnecessary desires, Socrates believes we feed the baser element of our soul, i.e., desire, at the expense of the higher one, i.e., reason. On Socrates' account, internal discord and ultimately unhappiness are the inevitable consequences of this unhealthy practice. End of footnote 640. Religious asceticism serves as a kind of antidote for this undesired element of human nature. Quote, when one sees, he observes, the way in which wealth getters enters an ideal into the very bone and marrow of our generation, one wonders whether a revival of the belief that poverty is a worthy religious vocation may not be the transformation of military courage and the spiritual reform which our time stands most in need of, end quote. Footnote 641 cites the source. In fact, James even claims that, quote, it is certain that the prevalent fear of poverty among the educated classes is the worst moral disease from which our civilization suffers, end quote. Footnote 642 cites the source. Moreover, James argues that living a life of poverty can help satisfy another basic need, namely, a need to overcome challenge and adversity. According to James, we all need some basic tension in our life, some degree of strenuousness, to add some color to it. James suggests that war is an example of something that ordinarily fulfills this need. Unfortunately, war comes with obvious terrible consequences, and James asserts that, quote, what we now need to discover in the social realm is the moral equivalent of war, something heroic that will speak to men as universally as war does, and yet will be as compatible with their spiritual selves as war has proved itself to be incompatible, end quote. Footnote 643 cites the source. Quote, may not voluntarily accepted poverty, James asks, be the strenuous life without the need of crushing weaker peoples, end quote. Footnote 644 cites the source. As I mentioned earlier, James believes that prayer constitutes the very essence of religion, insofar as it manifests the religious individual's belief in a higher power, as well as his or her adjustment to this higher power. According to James, prayer indicates belief on the part of the individual praying that there is someone or something there to hear the prayer, and further, that the endeavor is not a futile one. That is, praying will, in fact, bring about change. Along these lines, he suggests the following, quote, religion, in the vital sense in which these lectures study it, must stand or fall by the persuasion that effects of some sort genuinely do occur. Through prayer, religion insists things which cannot be realized in any other manner come about. Energy, which but for prayer would be bound, is by prayer set free and operates in some part, be it objective or subjective, of the world of facts. End quote. Footnote 645 cites the source. To be sure, the efficacy of prayer has been debated for centuries, and James himself has much to say regarding the practical effects of prayer. He suggests that while prayer certainly proves ineffective in some cases, it does yield positive results in other cases, and he specifically addresses two cases to support his view, prayer for better weather and prayer for the recovery of sick people. He claims that, in the case of praying for better health, prayer really does affect change for the better, while in the case of weather, it does not. Accordingly, he asserts, quote, as regards prayer for the sick, if any medical fact can be considered to stand firm, it is that in certain environments, prayer may contribute to recovery and should be encouraged as a therapeutic measure, end quote. However, quote, the case of the weather is different, end quote. Footnote 646 cites the source. In his view, a lot ultimately rides on the effectiveness of prayer, as indicated by the following, quote, if it be not effective, if it be not a give and take relation, if nothing be really transacted while it lasts, if the world is in no whit different for it having taken place, then prayer, taken in this wide meaning of a sense that something is transacting, is of course a feeling of what is illusory, and religion must on the whole be classed not simply as containing elements of delusion, these undoubtedly everywhere exist, but as being rooted in delusion altogether, just as materialists and atheists have always said it was, end quote. Footnote 647 cites the source. James points out that prayer can be said to affect change in one of two ways, in the objective natural world and in the subjective realm of the praying individual's private experience. Accordingly, he suggests, quote, it may well prove that the sphere of influence in prayer is subjective exclusively, and that what is immediately changed is only the mind of the praying person, end quote. Footnote 648 cites the source. In view of this, James claims that, if nothing else, prayer certainly does yield palpable consequences for the individual who prays. Hence, quote, the outward face of nature need not alter, but the expressions of meaning in it alter, end quote. Footnote 649 cites the source. And, quote, when we see all things in God and refer all things to him, we read in common matters superior expressions of meaning, end quote. Footnote 650 cites the source. Ultimately, regardless of whether change in the more public and objective sphere of life is affected, quote, existence as a whole appears transfigured, end quote. Footnote 651 cites the source, to the praying individual. He characterizes the specific ways in which prayer affects the private experience of the praying individual, suggesting, for example, that, quote, when one's affectations keep in touch with the divinity of the world's authorship, fear and egotism fall away, end quote, and that, quote, we meet a new world when we meet the old world in the spirit which this kind of prayer infuses, end quote. Footnote 652 cites the source. In the end, James suggests the impact prayer has on the subjective experience validates the notion that something is, in fact, transacted during prayer. Quote, so long as this operativeness is admitted to be real, he contends, it makes no essential difference whether its immediate effects be subjective or objective. The fundamental religious point is that in prayer, spiritual energy, which otherwise would slumber, does become active, and spiritual work of some kind is effected really. End quote. Footnote 653 cites the source. In addition to the benefits associated with religious belief in general, James speaks to a benefit exclusive to the once-born religious type, more specifically the minimization of evil, which is a defining feature of the once-born type, feeds a natural desire that James claims is latent in all of us. This is evident in the following passage, which I first alluded to in chapter 2. Quote, the systemic cultivation of a healthy mindedness as a religious attitude is therefore consonant with important currents in human nature, and is anything but absurd. In fact, we all do cultivate it more or less. We divert our attention from disease and death as much as we can, and the slaughterhouses and without indecencies without end on which our life is founded are huddled out of sight and never mentioned, so that the world we recognize officially in literature and in society is a poetic fiction, far handsomer and cleaner and better than the world that really is. End quote. Footnote 654 cites the source. While James clearly suggests that the once-born type offers a less genuine kind of experience, he still readily acknowledges the usefulness of marginalizing one's sense of evil. By contrast, quote, if we admit that evil is an essential part of our being and the key to the interpretation of our life, we load ourselves down with a difficulty that has always proved burdensome in philosophies of religion. End quote. Footnote 655 cites the source. Footnote 656. James proceeds to survey related problems, many of which were discussed in section C of part 3 in chapter 1. End of footnote 656. Indeed, the utility of this marginalization of evil explains the spread and longevity of the once-born type. Accordingly, James observes that, quote, the adequacy of their message to the mental needs of a large fraction of mankind is what gave force to those earlier gospels. Exactly the same adequacy holds in the case of the mind cure message, foolish as it may sound upon its surface. End quote. Footnote 657 cites the source. Ultimately, since it is, by its very nature, positive and uplifting, James claims that, quote, no one can fail of the regenerative influence of optimistic thinking, pertinaciously pursued, end quote. Footnote 658 cites the source. Clearly, James believes there is much to be said in religion's favor when it comes to an analysis of its utility. However, he also addresses religion's disadvantages too. For the most part, James roots these disadvantages in extravagance. He acknowledges that all the consequences associated with saintliness can be carried to excess, suggesting that, quote, we find that error by excess is exemplified by every saintly virtue, end quote. Footnote 659 cites the source. Hence, quote, the fruits of religion, in other words, are like all human products, liable to corruption by excess, end quote. Footnote 660 cites the source. As always, James offers a number of examples for each kind of religious excess. For instance, a religious individual may become so consumed by his or her desire for a life of purity that he or she completely withdraws from ordinary daily life altogether. Quote, one form of contact with the outer life being dropped after another to save the purity of inner tone, end quote. Footnote 661 cites the source. Quote, when the craving for moral constancy and purity is developed to this degree, James explains, the subject may well find the outer world too full of shocks to dwell in, and can unify his life and keep his soul unspotted only by withdrawing from it. End quote. Footnote 662 cites the source. Similarly, extreme asceticism proves problematic, as the individual indulging in it can engage in self-torture and other unhealthy forms of self-denial. Likewise, fanaticism denotes excessive devotion, a kind of, quote, loyalty carried to a convulsive extreme, end quote. Footnote 663 cites the source. Unfortunately, quote, a consequence of this condition of mind is jealousy for the deity's honor, end quote, and, quote, the slightest affront or neglect must be resented. The deity's enemies must be put to shame, end quote. Footnote 664 cites the source. Ultimately, quote, crusades have been preached and massacres instigated for no other reason than to remove a fancied slight upon the god, end quote. Footnote 665 cites the source. Finally, James explores the effects of excessive religious tenderness and charity, which is reflected by injunctions such as, quote, resist not evil, end quote, and, quote, love your enemies, end quote, from the Sermon on the Mount. Once again, James is quick to note that such advice would seem to be at odds with our natural impulses, and in an effort to gauge the effects of excessive religious charity, James makes a distinction between the world as it actually is and in an ideal world, while, quote, saintly conduct would be the most perfect conduct conceivable in an environment where all were saints already, i.e., in an ideal world. In an environment where few are saints, and many the exact reverse of saints, it must be ill-adapted, end quote. Footnote 666 cites the source. Thus, James concludes, quote, in the world that actually is, the virtues of sympathy, charity, and non-resistance may be, and often have been, manifested in excess, end quote. Footnote 667 cites the source. Hence, the primary concern in cases of excess religious charity is that the saint can be taken advantage of in the world as it actually is. As James suggests, quote, the saint may simply give the universe into the hands of the enemy by his trustfulness. He may, by non-resistance, cut off his own survival, end quote. Footnote 668 cites the source. Yet, even in his statement of its disadvantages, James remains sympathetic to religion, as is evidenced in the case of excessive charity. After all, even in excess, he suggests that there is an admirable quality to saintly tenderness, as it can still be, quote, a genuinely creative social force. The saints are authors, increasers of goodness, end quote. Footnote 669 cites the source. Hence, James reckons, quote, the saint may waste his tenderness and may be the dupe and victim of his charitable fever, but the general function of his charity and social evolution is vital and essential, end quote. Footnote 670 cites the source. Interestingly, James argues that religious excess is correlated with lower intelligence. On this point, he suggests, quote, what gives the impression of extravagance proves usually on examination to be a relative deficiency of intellect. Spiritual excitement takes pathological forms whenever other interests are too few and the intellect too narrow, end quote. Footnote 671 cites the source. In much the same way, he asserts that one's conception of God plays a factor in religious excess. Accordingly, a God most closely identified with honor and justice yields a greater likelihood of excess than a God more associated with love and humility. In this vein, James observes, quote, fanaticism must then be inscribed on the wrong side of religion's account, so long as the religious person's intellect is on the stage which the despotic kind of God satisfied. But as soon as the God is represented as less intent on his own honor and glory, it ceases to be a danger, end quote. Footnote 672 cites the source. According to James, we have seen a general historical refinement of the concept of God, thanks to which crass and problematic attributes of God naturally become less popular over time. For instance, once a staple of religious deities, the notion of a God who assigns eternal punishments and rewards and who provides salvation to some, but not to others, has grown less popular over time. As James suggests, quote, any God who, on the one hand, can care to keep a pedantically minute account of individual shortcomings, and on the other can feel such partialities and load particular creatures with such insipid marks of favor, is too small-minded a God for our credence, end quote. Footnote 673 cites the source. The upshot is that, in instances of religious excess, inferior intellects, immune to this general trend of religious refinement, continue to endorse older visions of God, in which case they often fail to produce the usual fruits of religious belief outlined earlier. In fact, James claims, quote, we feel that saintliness of character may yield almost absolutely worthless fruits if it be associated with such inferior intellectual sympathies, end quote. Footnote 674 cites the source. Once again, James seems to fear that the more problematic elements of religious belief associated with its less intelligent forms will cloud the judgment of one seeking to gauge religion's overall utility, and unduly affect any subsequent assessment of it as a result. Just as he makes it clear that we ought to divorce the ills associated with institutional elements of religion from religion proper, he urges us to do the same with respect to less intelligent forms of religious belief. Accordingly, he suggests, quote, we must not confound the essentials of saintliness, which are those general passions of which I have spoken, with its accidents, which are the special determinations of these passions at any historical moment, end quote. Footnote 675 cites the source. While I think James is justified in distinguishing the essential byproducts of religion from those that are more accidental, I think it would be a mistake to eliminate the latter from our survey of religion's utility altogether, for these accidents still arise as a result of religion, and would not have emerged otherwise. Accidental or not, these less magnanimous forms of belief still manifest bona fide effects of religion. So long as less intelligent people continue to populate the earth and espouse religious views, we shall have to deal with such unwanted consequences. In a similar fashion, James reflects on the relationship between religion and pathology, and expresses concerns that religion may be discounted due to the relationship between them. He certainly believes that they can coincide, suggesting early on in Varieties that, quote, as a matter of fact, a religious life exclusively pursued does tend to make the person exceptional and eccentric, end quote. Footnote 676 cites the source. Further, he adds, quote, religious geniuses have often shown symptoms of nervous instability, and they are, quote, creatures of exalted emotional sensibility, end quote. Footnote 677 cites the source. For this reason, he is worried some might dismiss religion on account of the fact that it can often stem from pathological origins, which is why he makes it a point to distinguish between the existential facts associated with religion and its spiritual value. See Part 1. Religion may, at times, be rooted in pathology, but James does not think that this gives us license to do away with it. Quote, judge the religious life by its results exclusively, he writes, and I shall assume that the bugaboo of morbid origin will scandalize your piety no more, end quote. Footnote 678 cites the source. Hence, on his account, that religion and pathology may cross paths is no mark against religion. What's more, James implies that there is likely a greater sense of significance associated with an individual's experience when they do cross paths, as he claims that religious experience rooted in pathology makes it more likely that an individual, quote, will make his mark and affect his age than if his temperament were less neurotic, end quote. Footnote 679 cites the source. However, he does clearly maintain that there is a point at which the pathological ceases to be religious. Consider, for instance, extreme melancholy, which is a form of pathology thanks to which the person afflicted by it cannot see any good in existence. As I indicated in section B of part 2, James is careful to distinguish extreme melancholics from the twice-born religious type, whom they tend to closely resemble. He does this by asserting that the religious are unequivocally optimistic in the long run, and are always able to appreciate the good in life, though this might take some time in the case of the twice-born type. So again, that was section A of part 3 of chapter 3, William James and the Varieties of Religious Experience, from The Utility of Religion, Mill, Nietzsche, and James. Thanks.